There was so much hope, so much optimism after the March on Washington. When people left, as Dr. King suggested, we went back home.
Let's get right to it. I'm listening to an interview that Time Magazine did with Congressman John Lewis that we're going to all listen to together in just a moment. Reverend John Lewis as well. Many people don't realize that he was an ordained Baptist minister. He graduated from Tennessee Baptist College and went on to seminary and decided at some point that instead of going into parish ministry, his calling would be, his vocation would be ministering in the public sphere, in elected office. And that's why I believe so many called him the conscience of Congress. He was a good man. He was a giant. And it's almost as if today's sermon is eulogizing him a bit, but it's getting at something that I think is still pertinent for us. It's certainly pertinent for what's going on in our nation around us. And that is this whole idea I played with just a moment ago. It won't get better if you pick it. And I don't mean picking at a scab. If you protest, sometimes it will get better. Sometimes it won't get better, but you have to do it anyway. And some of that is what's still going on in Portland, in Chicago, and other parts of our country right now. And I know, I've heard some of you say, well, we're tired of it. Can't they just get over it? Well, no, it's not done yet. Racism is still an issue, and there's going to be a bonus video. The same pastor you've heard me put videos up before from Wake Forest, North Carolina, talking about why it's important, especially for us white Americans, to talk about racism. And we need to speak up, not just our brothers and sisters of color. The protests sometimes have to happen. That's theological. It's speaking truth to power. And yet, sometimes it doesn't go very well. Reverend Lewis, Congressman Lewis, is going to talk about the march from Selma to Montgomery that he was a part of so many years ago. And we'll see a couple of pictures. We'll get to that in just a second. But I want to talk about this idea of protesting. Sometimes you strike because you don't have any other choice. The union says we've got to go on strike. And that's what finally gets management or the organization to listen. Teachers have had to do that here in North Carolina. And people have griped and complained, our kids aren't going to school, but teachers need a living wage, and they've been taken advantage of for a long time. I think that's a given. I don't think any of you will argue with that. I hope you won't argue with that. You might, but that's a different subject. It took that for their complaints to be heard. Sometimes it's happened that way, and sometimes it's gone well, sometimes it hasn't. Historically, the miners, the coal miners in Kentucky and West Virginia, the strike was their only way to get more than starvation wages. The mines had all the power. The mine owners had the company store. Miners lived in housing that was owned by the company, and you got out of line and you would be out of luck. They would have to strike. Yet, in the early 1900s, the way management dealt with the strikes is hiring thugs, that word we've heard so much lately, thugs coming in to beat people with axe handles and with baseball bats, putting some in the hospital, killing some, until, scared to death, the miners went back to work. And everything would go along as it had until the next explosion or the next strike or the next crisis. That's the history of that. You take your life in your hands sometimes, or at least your career, if you pick it, but sometimes it needs to be done. Most of you will remember 1981 and the PATCO strike, the Professional Air Traffic Controllers Organization, the Air Traffic Control Union. They were lobbying the FAA, excuse me. They needed a better working week. They were lobbying for a 32-hour work week because the stress of the job of being an air traffic controller was causing the suicide rate to go through the roof. They were lobbying for more health coverage, especially mental health coverage, again, because being an air traffic controller is one of the most stressful jobs on the planet. And the FAA was ignoring their needs. So they went on strike. President Reagan, whatever you think about Ronald Reagan, he could be decisive at times. He invoked the Taft-Hartley Act and said, this is essential, you have to go back to work, and over 11,000 of them refused. So President Reagan fired them unilaterally and also banned them from ever working for the federal government or any state government again. Their careers were effectively ended with the stroke of President Reagan's pen. What's ironic and a little frightening together is they started filling in with less qualified controllers, managers. They crossed over some military air traffic controllers. And for the next 4 or 5 years, they cobbled together a system that could handle maybe 60% of the flights that they had before. The public wasn't told that, by the way. But after 1981 until about 1986, the number of domestic airline flights in the U.S. was only about 60% of what it had been because they couldn't handle any more than that. And the controllers that were hired and trained, less experienced though they were given everything the PATCO controllers were asking for. A little bit ironic. The government was very clear to say it'll take about 2 years to get back to normal and everything will be fine. It'll be completely safe. Everything's covered. It took about 10 years to get back to normal. And the truth was, the period of the 1980s, not only did we have statistically more airline crashes than we had the decade before or the decade since, the question was raised in quite a few crashes. I don't want to exaggerate. Whether or not inexperienced air traffic controllers were part of what contributed to the crash. That was raised, not totally, but some of them. Delta Flight 191 in Dallas, coming into Dallas-Fort Worth, and I believe that was 1986. But it was coming in, there was heavy thunderstorms. We didn't have microburst technology to read microbursts on the field yet, but that Lockheed L-1011 TriStar was coming in and a microburst hit it and it crashed and tumbled into fuel tanks and it killed everyone on board. You probably remember hearing about that crash. The question was raised, why didn't the air traffic controllers notify pilots we've got heavy thunderstorm activity or at least close the runway for a period of time? It wasn't said that was contributing, but the question was raised in the NTSB report and investigation. There were some others during the 80s. Air Florida 90, remember the jet that crashed into the 14th Street Bridge in D.C. on taking off? There was questions about why the tower controllers weren't saying the conditions are too poor, let's hold off right now, or let's make mandatory de-icing within a certain amount of time. Did it contribute? Is there cause and effect? I don't know. I'm not qualified to know. But the list goes on. There was a mid-air collision between a Boeing 737 and a Cessna 172 in San Diego in that period of time. There was the Avianca Flight 52 crash coming into Kennedy where they ran out of fuel and they were trying to declare an emergency and somehow the air traffic controllers just didn't pay attention. That was all during that period of time where we had less qualified controllers because they'd picketed, they'd asked for it, and they stood up and they spoke truth to power, and the power said, you're done, you're fired. So it's obviously something to consider if we protest. And yet there are times when protests must be made. The early Christians realized to profess faith in Jesus Christ was in itself a protest, and one that often would lead to death. Because to admit faith in Jesus, you were saying you did not have faith in Caesar, and Caesar was considered God. That made you obviously a heretic and a traitor and an enemy. And to stand up for what you believed often meant your own cross. When Jesus said, take up your own cross, in the early church it was a literal thing. They understood it differently than we did. Some people may not know this, and some people may not want to know this, but Christians who were willing to stand up to the excesses of the Roman Empire during the reign of Nero were executed in a very weird, novel, and grotesque way. Nero would say, take them, and they were wrapped in flax. They were then doused with pitch and oil. They were impaled, you figure out where, upright on stakes in the Colosseum, and they were lighted afire so that they could be the stage lights for Nero's games. That's sometimes what protesting does. And we have right now people in our nation, like John Lewis and others, who are protesting and saying what started back in the 1960s, it's not finished, and what they're saying is true. We have to deal with that. I think we have to admit that. And we have to decide also, are we going to stand up and be counted as part of our faith? Listen to what Lewis said about it with me, and then we'll pick it up after. And there's a couple of more points I want to make. Just a couple.
There was so much hope, so much optimism after the March on Washington. When people left, as Dr. King suggested, we went back home, back to the heart of the Deep South. So many of us went into the state of Mississippi. We went into Alabama. We went to Selma. In Selma, only 2.1% of African American were registered to vote. The only time you could even attempt to register to vote was the first and third Mondays of each month. You had to stand in line, get a copy of the so-called literacy test. And hundreds and thousands of people would fail the so-called literacy test. They were told they could not read or write well enough. African American lawyers, doctors, teachers. So we started a series of demonstrations, standing in line at the courthouse. One evening, there was a demonstration for the right to vote. Nearby, Selma, confrontation occurred, and a young man tried to protect his mother. He was shot in the stomach, and a few days later, he died at the local hospital in Selma. We made a decision to attempt to march from Selma to Montgomery, to dramatize to the nation and to the world that people of color wanted to register to vote. We started walking. I was one of the leaders of that effort. I was wearing a backpack before it became fashionable to wear backpacks. In this backpack, I had 2 books. I thought we were going to be arrested and that we were going to go to jail, so I wanted to have something to read in jail. I wanted to have something to eat in that backpack. I had an apple and I had an orange. Since I thought we were going to be arrested and go to jail, and I'd be in jail with my friends, my colleagues, and neighbors, I wanted to be able to brush my teeth. I had toothpaste and toothbrush. We get to the highest point on the Edmund Pettus Bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers. And we continued to walk. We came within hearing distance of the state troopers. And a man spoke up and said, I'm Major John Cloud of the Alabama State Troopers. This is an unlawful march. It would not be allowed to continue. I give you 3 minutes to disperse and return to your homes or to your church. And a young man walking beside me by the name of Jose William from Dr. King's organization said, Major, give us a moment to kneel and pray before we can pass word back for people to kneel and pray. The major said, troopers advance. And you saw these men putting on their gas masks. They came toward us, beating us with nightsticks, tramping us with horses, and releasing the tear gas. Was hit in the head by a state trooper with a nightstick. My legs went from under me. I thought I saw death. I thought I was going to die. I thought it was the last nonviolent protest for me. I don't recall how I made it back across that bridge, across the Alabama River, through the streets of Selma, back to that little church. But I do recall being back at the church. It's full to capacity. More than 2,000 people on the outside trying to get in to protest what had happened. And someone asked me to say something, and I stood up and said something like, I don't understand it, how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam. And can I send troops to Selma, Alabama, to protect people who only desires to register to vote? And the next thing I knew, I'd been admitted to the Good Samaritan Hospital there in Selma, Alabama, with 16 other people. And the next morning, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and his colleague, the Reverend Ralph Abernathy, came to visit us in the hospital. And Dr. King said, don't worry, we will make it from Selma to Montgomery, and we get a Voting Rights Act passed. And he told us that he had urged religious leaders to come to Selma. So on Tuesday, March 9th, more than 1,000 ministers, priests, rabbis, and nuns came to Selma, and they marched to the point where we had been beaten 2 days earlier. That Tuesday night, one of the young ministers, we went out with 2 others to find something to eat, and on the way back from the little restaurant, they were attacked by members of the Klan. This young minister, James Reeb, was from Boston. He was so severely beaten, he was taken to a hospital in Birmingham, Alabama, where he died 2 days later. Selma gave us the Voting Rights Act the way Birmingham gave us the Civil Rights Act, and the March on Washington gave us the Civil Rights Act. If it hadn't been for Selma, hadn't been for the March on Washington, we wouldn't be where we are today. And there would be no Barack Obama as President of the United States of America.
Did you catch what he said right before the end? John Lewis believed that Selma gave us the Voting Rights Act. I think he's probably right. I think without the protests that we saw in the 1960s, Birmingham, Selma, the March on Washington, and many, many others, without the protests that happened right here in the 1970s when we had the Supreme Court ruling, Swan versus Charlotte Mecklenburg Board of Ed, that led to our high schools being integrated by forced busing, and there were protests on both sides of that. Without that, we wouldn't be where we are today, but we aren't there yet. It's not over yet, and that's what's happening around us. People are saying enough is enough. They're saying, truth be told, it is different to grow up and to live as a black person in America than as a white person. Not too long ago, I overheard a conversation about masks in stores, and I'm a big mask shamer. I will ask employees, you're not wearing a mask, I don't want to check out. It's my health I'm concerned with. Early on, it wasn't mandated yet. There was a gentleman there, and he said, well, sir, you're not wearing a mask. And he said, take one look at my face. And this was when we were all wearing bandanas still. He says, I'm a black man. I put a mask on and walk in here. You're going to call the police thinking I'm going to rob you, more than likely. And if the police see me wearing a mask and there's any question whatsoever, I'm afraid I might get shot. It was a wake up for me. I don't think the man was overreacting. He wasn't yelling. He wasn't upset about it. He was speaking very, very calmly, but he was saying essentially, this is my life. Look at it. Psalm 139 tells us each and every one of us is fearfully and wonderfully made. We heard people, most of whom had Down syndrome or other disabilities, read the scripture today. And they read it from a church where they are valued as full, contributing parts of that congregation. What a beautiful thing we saw today. And yet, we live in a nation where we still have people who are not viewed the way the psalm tells us they should be. We need to find our voice about that. And we need to recognize maybe we still need protests. Maybe we still need to speak truth to power. And that gets to the one point, and that is when people say, yeah, but people, they're burning Minneapolis. They burn part of Washington. They're lighting fires. They're looting stores. Some are. I agree. Some are acting out in ways that are absolutely despicable and cannot be justified whatsoever. And if you notice when you listen to John Lewis or any of the civil rights marchers from the 1960s, everyone was committed to peaceful protests. When they were savagely beaten on the Evan Pettus Bridge, they did not fight back. And that was one of the reasons why Malcolm X had nothing to do with Martin Luther King's movement. He wanted to fight back. Martin Luther King said, no, it's got to be peaceful or it doesn't work. So there are people making the opposition's point for them. And yet, I don't condone it, but can I understand it? Let me tell you a story that I think gets at that, I believe. I'm telling a story on my best friend. Stuart, if you are watching, or when you and Marcia watch, I'm talking about Casey, brother. So, anyway, you know it's coming. I didn't ask your permission beforehand. I'll have to ask your forgiveness afterwards. Some of you know Stuart Brashear. He is really my best friend, I think, in the area. And for a long time, we've done things together. For a while, he was also my boss for some things. Stuart used to do, and may still do some of it in a different way, quarry surveying. Technically, it's called volumetric laser surveying for quarrying and asphalt companies anywhere there's an aggregate pile. And Stuart had me helping him some. The way you do it is you go into a quarry where there's piles of gravel, granite, sand, limestone, whatever, and everywhere there's a pile, you set up a laser machine that you're going to see a picture of, and you shoot different points all around that pile, and the laser compiles a picture that gives you the cubic yards of material. And then you hand it to the client and say, you have X number of cubic yards, and they say, and that's granite sand, so that means X amount of tons of material. It's their way of doing inventory. Exhausting, hot, dirty, because you're down in a quarry. And there's one thing about a quarry in the South, especially in summer, is all of these piles of gravel and sand act like reflectors, and it's down in the quarry amidst those piles, and that's the nearest thing to being on the backside of the sun that I've ever experienced. You use the laser, you get all your points. Sometimes it can be upwards of 10, 20, 30 setups and stations all around it, and then you let the computer chew on the numbers. Your data from the whole thing, the whole day's work, is on one of these, a compact flash card. Well, one thing is that every now and then the laser would get wonky. And that happened once. We were at the Casey Quarry, just outside of Columbia, South Carolina, in summer. It was 95 degrees temperature, and around the piles it was easily 105. Not much breeze blowing. And if you look at the picture, you're going to see at Casey there is one pile of granite sand that isn't just a pile of sand, it's a mountain. And it takes, Stuart will have to correct me if I'm wrong, I believe we set up 23 or 24 stations to go all the way around to shoot this pile. The picture of me you see, that is me, that fuzzy picture. I'm on top of the granite sand pile. And you can notice it's about 200 feet tall from where you're looking. It's about a quarter of a mile long. That's a big pile of sand. 95 degree heat, lugging that 100-pound laser one station to another, to another, to another. And the day's dragging on and on and on. We're both sweaty and hot. I'm losing my mind in the heat. We get to the very end. We're done. Stuart pulls this card, takes it out and puts it in the card reader, puts it in the computer, and the computer says error, invalid data, or some error message. It wasn't reading. There was some corruption in the data that we had just spent hours and hours in the heat getting. And at that point, it was a long day, but at that point, my friend Stuart opened the little port, pulled out the data card, and went, "Ah!" or something like that. I think he probably said something, but even if I remembered it, I wouldn't say it here. Took the data card and threw it as hard as he could over into a slurry pit where there was nothing but granite, mud, and water and piles of stuff that had drained out. Couldn't follow it if you wanted. No way. It was gone. And I wasn't able to stop or get my voice fast enough to go, whoa, 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 no, whoa. Maybe we can work with the data. Happened a couple of times later, and I did find out, took it home, played with it. Open the data in a text file, and you look, and what the laser had done is simply put a couple of null blocks into the last file and hadn't put the ending thing on it to cap the file off. You take the null blocks out, you put a semicolon in to finish the file, and presto, your data's back. Probably wasn't the best move that it was ever made, that Stuart made that day, because we threw that all away, had to reshoot it. I think he reshot it himself too, went down the heat. Which had to have been even worse than helping. Wasn't a great move, and I bet Stuart would agree with me on that. But did I understand why he did it? Yeah, you bet I did. Have we ever, each and every one of us, reached a point where it's the straw that breaks the camel's back? We've hit our tipping point. Whatever the situation is, whatever the case may be, it has gotten on our very last nerve, and we do something unwise, foolish, something that we regret, and later on we look back on it and we regret. Ever been in that situation? Every one of you listening to this, ever been in that situation? I'll give you the answer. Of course you have. And if you're saying no right now, you're lying to yourself. You know that. I know that. I've been in that situation. When I was on work crew for a bike trip in 11th grade, we had made a commitment, and it was viewed as a spiritual commitment. We will stick it out for the entire trip. It's going to be hard work. We will stick it out. I got sick because it rained almost every day. I got sick and a couple others got sick, and we got to the camp where we were going to take a break before going and finishing the trip. And 3 of us were being sent home. Well, I had tonsillitis so bad I ended up having my tonsils out. But I'd made a commitment to Christ that I would finish the trip. And here was the director saying, no, you can't finish, you've got to go home. I couldn't deal with that. No, I'd made a commitment. You're sick. I know that. I made a commitment. You're going home. I don't want to go. We were asked to go into a cabin, an empty cabin, and talk about it. And people were saying, well, I'm sorry, da-da-da. And I got so angry about not being able to fulfill my commitment that I punched a wooden bunk as hard as I could. And I broke 2 bones in my hand doing it. So not only did I have my tonsils out, I recovered with a cast on my arm. Not a great move, right? Probably shouldn't have done it. Yes. Can you understand why I did it? As an 11th grade, frustrated, just at the end of my rope. Think about people who've been hearing for 50 years there's no such thing as racism, and yet they live it every day. Think about systems that continue to put people at a disadvantage for no fault of their own, just because of who they are. They were born to the wrong family. They were born in the wrong part of town. They were raised in the wrong high school. Can we not understand that sometimes the frustration may build to the point that they do just go, ah, give me a match. Find me a lighter. Sure, we can understand it. That's not to say we condone it. That's something different. That's the same thing as saying we do not condone this QAnon nonsense that some people are saying, that there's this deep state that's trying to human traffic and sell kids through pizza parlors and all that. That's just total nonsense. Can I understand why some people feel so disenfranchised in the political process that they might be tempted to believe that? Sure, I can understand it. Either way, the point we're missing is Scripture very clearly calls us to say each and every one of us is a cherished, individually created child of God, just like we are, warts and faults included. And we say, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works, that I know full well. Those works that are wonderful, it's me. It's you. It's R.J. Knox. It's Samori Knox. It's their brother TJ. It's Gerald and Tymir and Terrell and Jurel and Quentin and K1. They're our brothers. And the only difference is that their skin is a different color than ours, and yet being our brothers, some of us, we can't imagine what it is like to be in their skin. And that's my last point, and I'll be quiet. Jim Loder was one of the smartest professors that I knew at Princeton Seminary. He was also one of the most spiritual men I've ever met in my life. He taught us as much by his prayers as he did by his lectures. Dr. Loder talked about a man who did bat studies in the 1950s. No one really can remember. Was the guy's name Arnsberger? I want to say Arnsberger, Bill Arnsberger, but he was the coach at LSU and an NFL football coach, so that's wrong. This guy was so out there, minuscule was his study, that you can't find him on Google. But Dr. Loder knew of the study, and he mentioned it several times, because the man's study said, as he summed it up, that if he tried as hard as he could, he might be able to tell you what it would be like for him to be a bat. He had studied bat behavior so well, he would say, I think I could express to you what it would be like for me to be a bat. However, I can never express to you what it is like for a bat to be a bat. I can't get there. Put that into this context, especially those of you who, like me, are Caucasian, and who, like me, also love our brothers and sisters of color. I might, maybe, if I tried real hard, I might be able to tell you what it would be like for me to be black. Maybe. But I can never, ever express to you what it is like for my black brothers and sisters to be black. And now's the time, I believe, even if it doesn't get better if you pick it, now is the time for us to recognize Psalm 139 says that's our brothers and our sisters, and they need our back. Some of them in different cities, they need our back. That's not condoning violence. That's not just looking the other way when people do stupid things like throw Molotov cocktails. It's also not looking the other way when police come in without being identified, looking like stormtroopers, and abduct people. They're not arresting people, they're abducting them. We need to find our voice and say, this is not what God created us for. This is not the community Jesus Christ died for. And we need to find our voice. One of the bonus videos, if you choose to watch it, we'll talk about that. Another bonus video will be one of the best preachers in the United States, Barbara Brown Taylor. And she's talking in an ancillary way about this very thing. She's talking about it between religions, but it can easily go between cultures, between races, between various groups. She says, don't ever forget, we should never compare our best to someone else's worst. It doesn't work that way. Compare their best to our best, and if you really want to figure out what somebody else believes and how they live, ask the adherents, don't ask their critics. It's a town hall from Westminster Presbyterian Church in Minneapolis. It's worth a listen. It's 50 minutes long, so you've got some devotional material here for the rest of the week. I'd say it's your homework. Mainly, I'm just saying you're invited to look at it. I think it's worth your time. You can be the judge of that. Amen.